Hello, I'm Mark Payne with the West Virginia Humanities Council. Welcome to History Alive. History Alive is a program of the West Virginia Humanities Council that brings historical figures to life through portrayals by presenters who have conducted thorough research into their character. The Humanities Council makes these characters available at no cost to nonprofit organizations across West Virginia such as schools, libraries, historical societies, and a wide range of civic groups. History Live is designed as an interactive experience between the character and the audience. We encourage your organization to host a presentation and bring a figure from history for a visit with your audience or students. Having someone like Robert E. Lee or Ann Bailey come to speak to your group can really breathe life into these important people from history and make them seem much more real. Nothing compares to the live in-person visit. Each presentation consists of 3 parts: a monologue, a question and answer session with the character, and then the presenter breaks character to answer questions about he or she conducted their research. The 15 presenters on our History Live roster have researched a variety of sources such as diaries, journals, letters, official documents, autobiographies, and the research of other scholars in developing their character. A History Live presentation is not a play. It's very much an audience participation event that relies on interaction between the audience and the character. Being able to ask your own questions of these important figures from the past is both fun and educational. It's very difficult to reproduce here in the studio the feel of an actual History Live presentation. Without an audience to ask questions, we have to depart from the usual format. And that means that our guests will sit with me and answer a few questions, interview style, rather than taking questions from an audience. But we hope to give you a sample of how a History Live presentation can add to the offerings at your school or organization. There will be information on your screen at the end of this program about how to contact a Humanities Council about bringing a History Live character to your community. At this time, I would like to welcome today's guest from history. We are very fortunate to have with us Margaret Blennerhassett.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I have come to tell you stories about the years in which I lived on an island you know as Blennerhassett Island. My life has been one of great happiness and great tragedy besides. It has involved famous men such as Burr, Alexander Hamilton, and President Thomas Jefferson. But I do wish to begin my story with those most happy years. The years in which my husband, Harmon Blennerhassett, and I left our native countries of England and Ireland and traveled all the way across the great Atlantic Ocean to make our homes in the farthest western outposts of America, the deep, dark western lands of Western Virginia and the Ohio frontier. Oh, it was a strange and mysterious land to us. Trees and more trees as far as our eye could see. The trees were so enormous, so dense, and so thick overhead that they formed a great green canopy. And down below, there was a constant twilight, an eerie stillness that even on the darkest days in midsummer, there was a perpetual stillness across the land. It seemed to us, however, a land of great hope, a land of possibility. I wrote home to my family saying, "Why, people here believe that roast beef grows on trees, and fat pigs cry out, 'Come and eat me.'" In Marietta, they bragged that the corn would grow 14 inches overnight, and catfish as large as 150 pounds could be fished from the Ohio River. Just imagine such a place. Now, perhaps you can tell that I am not your ordinary frontier lady. my husband and I came to the rugged western lands with the one thing that virtually no one else had. We had money. A very great deal of money. In the year 1800, our fortune amounted to some $150,000. And with that money, we were to build the most beautiful home that had ever been created in the West. Our first task, of course, was to find land, property on which to build our home. We learned that there was just downriver from our initial settlement in Marietta, just down the river, an island. Half of that island was available to us. It was owned by a man named Elijah Backus. Mr. Backus was willing to sell us half of his island for a sum of $4,500, somewhere in the range of 200 acres. We learned later, however, that just a few years before we purchased half of Mr. Backus's island for $4,500, Mr. Backus had in fact purchased the entire island for himself at an amount of only $800. It was the first, but not the last time that we were to be deceived in our settlement in the Ohio Valley. You see, my husband and I were strangers. We were foreigners, unaccustomed to ways of life in the frontier. So again and again, we were told lies, and we believed them because we were very generous and trusting by nature. Nevertheless, we set about to build our dream. Let me remind you that most people in the Ohio frontier and the regions of Western Virginia lived in tiny 1 or 2 room cabins, nothing more than a dirt floor, an oiled cloth serving as window glass, window covering. In contrast to that, my friends, we had a grand mansion. Allow me to show you our home on Blennerhassett Island. We had a mansion of 12 glorious rooms. In addition, 2 appendages, one serving as my husband's office, the other as our summer kitchen. Inside, it was so magnificent. We had one room paneled from floor to ceiling in rare black walnut. Edging the ceilings was real gold. We had silver doorknobs and door hinges, alabaster lamps, and on the floors, the finest, most sumptuous Turkish carpetings. If that were not grand enough, outside we were said to have the most beautiful gardens in all of America. We had acres of flowers. We had fruit trees, ponds, gazebos, a real English maze. We even had shrubbery trimmed in the shapes of the 13 colonies. Our home was said to be like paradise. It was said to be the very Garden of Eden itself. But you do know the Garden of Eden story. You know that into the Garden of Eden comes a creature to destroy it. Into our garden was said to come that serpent in the form of a man named Aaron Burr. Now, I could tell you many things about Aaron Burr, but I will tell you just a few. First of all, Aaron Burr is a genius. Second, he was a great war hero in the Revolutionary War. I suspect that you probably do not know that in the election of 1800, Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson were tied for the office of president. Can you imagine anything more bewildering than a tie for the office of president? All of that counting and recounting of votes, it was endless. At last, it was decided that Jefferson would be president and Aaron Burr his vice president. But relations between the two men were not harmonious. Then there is the business of Aaron Burr and the duel, in which he killed Alexander Hamilton and heavily damaged his reputation. I shall tell you one final thing about Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr likes money. He likes to live well, but he likes to live well on other people's money. It was that search for money that brought Aaron Burr to visit us on Blennerhassett Island. He came on a lovely May evening. We invited him for dinner. We invited him to stay overnight upstairs in our guest chambers, but Aaron Burr declined in a way that made him seem very humble. He said that he would prefer to make his bed on the boat which brought him to the island in the manner of a soldier. Since it was a lovely May evening, my husband and I linked arms to escort Aaron Burr down to the dock where his boat was waiting. But just as he prepared to step on board, he suddenly slipped and fell. Getting up, he brushed himself off and said words that still turn my heart to ice. He said, "That was an ill omen, a bad sign of everything that would come." And it was. It was. Now, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to discuss for you, just a moment, President Thomas Jefferson. Now, I suppose you believe that Jefferson is a great man, a man of illustrious character. But the real truth, ladies and gentlemen, is that the actual serpent who glided into the Blennerhassett's garden was not Aaron Burr. It was, in fact, Thomas Jefferson who destroyed us. How could such a thing happen? Well, we had begun to realize, my husband and I, on Blennerhassett Island, that our fortune was in very serious decline. We had even considered selling our beautiful mansion and moving elsewhere to recover. But no one had the money to buy it. So when Aaron Burr arrived with an investment plan, we were most eager to participate because it seemed sound and wise. He suggested that we take part in an expedition to settle land beyond the boundaries of America, land belonging to Spain. And we were eager participants. But there was a problem. That problem was Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson claimed that Aaron Burr's plan was treason, punishable by death, and he called for Aaron Burr's arrest. That meant that my husband was also subject to being arrested. Both men fled to escape with their lives, but it was not long before both men were arrested and placed in jail in Richmond, Virginia, to await a trial which many believe will live on as one of the most famous, the most important trials ever in America. The outcome, my friends, was tragedy. Although Aaron Burr was found not guilty of any crime, and my husband was released from jail, we were never able to return to our beloved home. While we were away, men and women descended like a pack of hungry wolves. They carried away all of our belongings. And before we could reclaim our island and mansion, it was taken from us. And if that were not tragic enough, some 5 years after we were forced away, the mansion burned completely to the ground, leaving nothing of our hopes and dreams except a handful of ashes. All of it gone forever.
We're back with Margaret Blennerhassett, and Mrs. Blennerhassett has agreed to answer a few questions, of which we are appreciative. I guess my first question for you, if I may call you Margaret?
Indeed, sir.
Thank you. Where did you acquire your wealth that allowed you and your husband to come to America from England?
Well, my husband's family, the Blennerhassett family, owned a castle in Ireland, a castle called Castle Conway. And with that estate were 7,000 acres of land. So when my husband inherited it, he sold it, and with those proceeds we established ourselves in the wilderness.
So when you came to America, did you come directly to the Ohio Valley?
Well, no, sir. In fact, we initially established ourselves first in the greater cities, in New York and Philadelphia, but we were not suited for life there. We wanted to embark on a great adventure instead.
But did you find your new home in the wilderness? Were there any similarities between where you left in England to your new home?
Well, only those similarities that we created with our wealth. We sought to establish a little outpost of English civilization in the wild, rugged lands.
Yes. Do you have children?
Well, that is a rather interesting matter. My husband and I believed initially, when we set ourselves a home in the mansion, that we were not to be blessed with children. We then adopted a son, a little boy of age 6. And next, I went on to have 5 children of my own. But 2 of those children, 2 little girls, have perished.
Oh, well, that's unfortunate. If I could ask you, what is a typical day like for you in your life?
Well, there are many duties involved in running an estate, but I am quite an athlete myself. I love to ride horseback. I sometimes walk the distance from the island to Marietta, which is 12 miles, and have breakfast and turn around and walk home, outdistancing even males as fleet as you, sir.
Well, that's got to be quite an accomplishment then. How long have you lived on the island?
Well, we only were on the island for a rather short time. Our mansion was completed in the year 1800, and we were forced away in the year 1806.
And what year did you arrive in America?
We came to America in 1797 and to the Ohio Valley in 1798.
Oh, so it didn't take you long to get to the Ohio Valley, did it?
And only 2 years to build the mansion, which surprises many people.
What does your husband do to make a living?
Well, my husband was trained as a lawyer, but he has not been well suited for the life that we have undertaken on the island, which is the life of a gentleman farmer. He has embarked on several business ventures, but they have not prospered.
You mentioned when you were speaking earlier about Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson's allegation of treason. Would you care to expand just a little bit on what your involvement was with Mr. Burr?
Well, Jefferson maintained that we, along with Aaron Burr, were assembling a huge army on the island, set to take over the western lands and to create our own empire. Well, there was an assemblage on Blennerhassett Island, but it was a small colonizing expedition made up of families, children, and a large contingency of dangerous and heavily armed cows. Nothing more, I can assure you.
Well, what is it that you, or is there anything that you miss about where you came from? Was it the north of England?
My family was from the north of England. My grandfather fought in the Revolutionary War on the side of the British, of course. Mm-hmm. And I do miss my family. They are very far away. But we considered our lives in America to be idyllic, but we were badly mistaken, I'm afraid, and we have not been happy in America.
Well, that's unfortunate. So what I would like to do for my final question for you then is to ask, on the heels of that response, what would you say has been the best thing that has happened to you since you've come to this country?
Well, I suspect the best thing that has happened to us is to gain wisdom. We were very trusting, and I'm afraid that we have trusted in the wrong people. So we have gained maturity as we have lost our fortune, I'm afraid.
Well, at this point, I would like to now introduce to you the presenter of Margaret Blennerhassett, and this is Deborah Connor, who lives up in the Parkersburg area. Deborah, welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
Appreciate
it's a pleasure to be here.
Appreciate you very much to be here. Now I want to ask you some questions about your research, and I want to ask Deborah Connor questions as opposed to Margaret Blennerhassett. And my first question is, why Margaret Blennerhassett? What was it about her that interested you in doing the research and portraying her as a character?
Well, Margaret Blennerhassett was not my first character. In 1997, I embarked on my first in-character portrayal, and that was as the poet Emily Dickinson. The following year, the West Virginia Humanities Council was interested in creating a program called History Alive, and those characters were often connected with West Virginia history. So I began looking at women from the history of the state of West Virginia, and because I live in Parkersburg, Margaret Blennerhassett was a logical choice. I mean, her home is almost in my backyard. I found that the Blennerhassett story, as I began researching it, was far more interesting than I had ever realized. And although I knew the superficial details, there's far more drama and intrigue and color and historical importance than I ever realized.
Right. And of course, one of the very important parts of the History Live program is the research that goes into developing and defining these characters. How did you go about starting your research and getting into the skin of Margaret Blennerhassett? What sources did you go to?
Well, I always tell people that in order to do an in-character portrayal, you have to love to read and research, and for me that is a deep calling. My most useful source, however, was a human one. Dr. Ray Swick of the Blennerhassett Island Foundation, and also of the West Virginia State Parks. He's the West Virginia State Parks historian, excuse me. Mm-hmm. He is the world authority on the Blennerhassetts. He did his PhD work on the Blennerhassetts and has had a lifelong fascination with them. So he provides answers to my questions and steers me in the direction of learning more through the resources that are available in the Parkersburg area.
Well, that's awfully handy.
It's very handy.
Of course, one of the features of the History Live is that when you arrive at a venue or a school or an organization that's hosting you in person to do Margaret Blennerhassett or any of your other characters, you are in character when you're there. So if I ask you what your thought is on jet planes or whatever, you're not going to know because you're talking directly to us from another time. So now, because you're out of character, I would like to ask you if you could give a little information on why did Harmon and Margaret Blennerhassett come to America? They were very well-to-do, had a lot of money. What prompted them to chuck all that and head to the wilderness?
That's a very important question because it illuminates many aspects of the Blennerhassett story. First of all, the Blennerhassetts came to America because they were related to one another. Harmon Blennerhassett was also, in addition to Margaret's husband, he was her uncle. And marriages such as theirs were beginning in England to be looked upon with disfavor by the Church of England. Had they stayed in England, it could have come to the point where children that would have resulted from their union could have been considered illegitimate. In addition to that, Harmon was also involved in some anti-British activity in Ireland. And if things had gotten much worse for him, he could have been considered a hunted man. So what better way to get out of all of the scandal and the possible serious consequences of staying in England and Ireland? What better way to put that behind you than to come to America?
It created a little distance. I was not aware of that. That's pretty interesting. You have done this on the History Live roster and through the History Live program a lot, and I know that you travel widely and do your presentations. Of course, again, this being in a television studio, we don't really get the chance to do your entire presentation. Typically, when you go out and do this live, about how long does your presentation last, and what do you do? I know there were some things that you would normally do that you didn't really have a chance to do today.
A typical program with the question and answer segments included and the audience interaction. I'm very audience interactive during a program. I get people from the audience to come on stage and reenact the duel between Hamilton and Burr. I often ask them questions. I get a gentleman to kiss my hand and things like that. So between that and the question and answer, I always say about an hour.
Well, Deborah, I really want to thank you again for being here and presenting Margaret Blennerhassett for us on today's program. There's information here you'll be able to see on the screen about how to contact the Humanities Council. If you would like to invite Deborah Connor to come and be Margaret Blennerhassett in your community, she would love to do that, and we would love to have her do that. So at this point, I want to thank Deborah. I almost called you Margaret. I want to thank Deborah again for being here, and want to remind you that helping to keep you informed on the Library Television Network. Thank you for watching History Alive.